Welcome back to Out of the Fold. This episode is the second part of 3 about Rachel Casey. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, please do so before listening to this one. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comment about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. We left off talking about the Armageddon predictions associated with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I sort of have this thing about the Armageddon prophecies. Like I think I've learned to laugh about it mostly just because I kind of laugh about my own anxiety about it. I went to a I went to an evangelical school, so it's like, when I hear about these prophecies sometimes, despite the fact that I don't believe what I was taught anymore, I get sort of like this twinge every once in a while, like oh shit, like what if this is the one? Like what if I'm wrong and this actually is the one? I think like 8 years ago, before I had like officially said that I don't believe anymore, and like it was I was still just sort of questioning. It was just sort of this thing in the back of my mind. I was living my life, but I really wasn't thinking that much about religion. There was one where I think it was this guy from Focus on the Family, and people donated millions of dollars to him, and then it didn't happen. But I remember that on that day, he said that it was going to happen at like 11 a.m. I think like the night before and that day, I had like a little bit of anxiety, like what if it actually is going to happen? But I wasn't taught that it was. Just when I was growing up, like I was taught that, yes, we are in the end times. But then I looked back at how many of these predictions there have been. And you're right that each time they just say, we were reading the Bible incorrectly. Now it's going to happen 3 years from now. And they just keep doing this over and over and over again. So, and
people still buy it.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's like it's actually funny just because I can laugh at myself for like getting some anxiety each time I know that we're on the day that it's supposed to happen. But again, you're right. Like it's not that funny because people are using that for fear to get people to keep believing, and then they're letting they're letting kids die because of that fear and that belief that they're putting in. That's fucked up.
Yeah. I honestly, during those, few last years that I was still in it, my grandfather died when I was maybe 14 or 15. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember it was while I was still homeschooled, so it was before I actually was in public school. So it was before I was 15, actually. That was the first close member of my family who had ever died that I had known. He died of cancer. It had originally been prostate cancer that had gone into remission, but it came back and it had spread to his bones, and he died very slowly and very painfully. And it was the first time that I was really faced with this hope of resurrection. Like, is this really going to happen? Am I really going to be able to see him again? Because obviously, it took him months and months and months of agony to die. So we were pretty much constantly faced with this idea of death. And my family is very close. Almost all of them live in the same city. At least at the time, we all lived in the same city. I think one of my aunts lived in maybe like 20 minutes away, like a different city 20 minutes away, but close enough that we were all very, very close. We used to live like blocks away from each other. I used to be able to walk to my grandparents' house and my uncle and aunt, two different uncle and aunt's houses from our house, like just a 5-minute walk. So we were all very close. And the patriarch of our family is dying, and it's it was very brutal on the whole family. And for the last few years, what I was really starting to it wasn't even really that I was questioning the faith as much as I was losing it.
Right.
Just I couldn't be the good Jehovah's Witness, and I couldn't maintain that anymore, and it was pretty much just killing me to try. But in those last years, all I could think about was seeing my grandfather again, and how I could not afford to lose that. And I guess eventually I just came to the conclusion that I couldn't live for the dead. I was going to die. Like I was so depressed, and I knew that it was killing me to keep up this ruse and keep leading this, double life. When I was in my junior year, I came out to my parents as bisexual, and they took it surprisingly well. I cried not because I felt rejected by them, but because I did not expect them to not reject me. And they basically told me, okay, well, how long have you felt this way? And I was like, since I was little, but I guess I didn't really recognize it because I later identified myself as pansexual. But at the time, I just used the term bisexual. Basically, as long as I have been alive, I've just loved everyone.
Right.
I have never, even as far as looks go, I am so indiscriminate. I just love everybody. And I realized that in myself, and I was like, okay, I think that I have some same-sex attraction. And I told my family right before a family worship evening, which is basically just everybody in the family sits down and studies some propaganda literature together, basically. Led by the father, because men are the head of the household, etc. And I sat down and I was like, okay, after family worship is over, I need to tell you guys something. And they were like, just tell us now. And I was like, I don't want to ruin family worship, okay? Just wait until the end. But they made me say it. And because I don't remember if it was my sister or my mother, but they were like, are you pregnant? I was like, what? No. I said, it's a good thing. And then, of course, when they got me to say, okay, I'm bi, they were like, that's not a good thing. And I was like, well, it's definitely better than being pregnant, okay? And I was like, and they were like, yeah, you're right. They're like, okay, you're right. But yeah, when I was talking to my parents, they basically, I think the thing that I took away from it, even though I knew they weren't going to be 100% accepting, was that they didn't immediately reject me, and they never told me that, they never invalidated my feelings. They never basically made me feel like I was in the wrong for feeling the way that I felt, or that I was, confused or lying to myself or making it up or anything. They never accused me of anything like that. And that bugs me even now, in the sense that it makes me think that if they weren't witnesses, that they would have been fully supportive of me.
Right.
Because they didn't immediately respond with unabashed homophobia. The fact that they were just as close to supportive as they could get away with while still being good Christian parents makes me think that if it weren't for the religion, they would have been 100% supportive of me. Yeah. And so towards the end, I had when I was in high school, I had, quote, worldly friends who were, who I met in high school. And my very best friend, he was a transgender guy, and we had a lot of discussions about gender and sexuality and just our own identities. And we had discussions about religion, and we became very close, and he was my best friend for a long time. We wrote together a lot. He was kind of helping me write a book. We both really were very passionate about writing. It was something that we both enjoyed. He had a girlfriend all the while that we were friends in high school, and I soon became friends with her as well. And I started to feel increasingly guilty about being friends with them, because they were exposing me to, they were exposing me to sexuality, they were exposing me to swearing, they were exposing me to politics. And I realized, and we went to a Jehovah's Witness convention, which is basically just where they tell you all the big stuff you need to know for the year, which it's a 3-day long, like a weekend long convention. not 3 days straight. Like, you don't have to stay there overnight or anything. But they always they emphasized the scripture that was something like, it was something that Jesus said, I believe, about, if your right hand is making you stumble, cut it off. If your eye is making you sin, gouge it out, which is really graphic. But the idea was you will sacrifice anything to get to the end.
Right.
You will sacrifice whatever it takes, no matter how much it hurts, to get to the goal. And I realized that what I needed to sacrifice to keep my faith intact was my friends. They were leading me astray spiritually, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I told them, I'm sorry, but we can't even talk anymore. And they tried to convince me to stay, and it was really brutal emotionally for both of us. And basically at the last second, they came to me and they were like, hey, so I think that we could agree that we all really like each other. What if we got into like a 3-way relationship? And that was when I was kind of like, you know what? Satan, fine. You win. I'm giving it all up. I'm just going to do what I want to do now, okay? And that was really how I felt about it. Like, it was something that I really wanted and I was really happy about, but I felt like it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like giving in to temptation, and it made me feel really gross about it. But it was like I'm finally pursuing something that makes me happy with people that make me happy.
Right.
But at the same time, I just felt like, even though I was doing it, and I was doing it, at least I thought, unapologetically, I still was like, yep, Satan won on this one. I'm out. Whatever. And of course later I learned not to feel that way about it. But at the time, even when I decided, this is over, I didn't think this whole religion thing is silly. They make me feel so guilty about everything. I was just thinking, Satan's won. I give up. I'm going to die in Armageddon. Whatever. That was really what I thought. I thought that I was going to die because of this.
Right.
And I just accepted that because trying not to die was too hard.
Yeah. Did you at the time identify as polyamorous as well then?
Yes. And I guess that I still technically am, because obviously that hasn't changed, but I guess it's not, and obviously now I'm in a monogamous relationship that I'm very happy with, so I don't feel the need to pursue anything else, but I guess I would still consider myself polyamorous, yeah.
I don't know if this is a term, but you almost sound like it'd be like pan-amorous also. It's like you could be in a monogamous relationship or you could be in a polyamorous relationship, and either would be fine. Yeah.
That would probably be a good way to describe it, to be honest. I'm just kind of like, I like relationships, short relationships, long relationships, relationships that have a lot of meaning, relationships that are, I don't know, purely chemical attraction, whatever. I enjoy the human experience, I guess, of love.
Yeah.
And I realize now that that's something great about me. When I came out to my coworkers at the time, I worked somewhere else from where I work now, but I worked at a retail department store. And I came out to my coworkers and said, I have a boyfriend and a girlfriend. And at first they were like, what? And then they were like, you know what, Rachel? That totally fits you. Nobody else would do that but you.
Right.
That just makes sense for everything that I know about you. You would be in a relationship with a guy and a girl at the same time and just be like, yep, this is me happy. And it made me feel really great because I was just like, yes, this is me. Even though it was something that at the same time I was like, yep, I'm going to die for this, but I'm going to die for it. Like, this is the hill I'm going to die on, literally. That's it.
It's been cool when I've been doing this show. I've noticed that most of the people that I've spoken with have left religion not because they had like some big horrible experience, although some of them have. A lot of them have left because they just realized that they loved people a hell of a lot more than they ever loved God. And it was interesting because, like, to me, that actually seems I don't want to say like it seems Christian, but it's like the big thing that Jesus wanted people to do was love one another. If you really want to break it down, like Jesus, yes, he said some other things that were that people don't like to talk about, like, if you don't believe in him, then kill that person in front of me. Like, okay, like that's not great.
Yeah.
But a big like reason that he wanted people to do that is if they didn't believe his view about the importance of loving each other. So it's like, it's almost like it's like, obviously not believing in God does make you not able to get into heaven, but like, what could be more loving than being willing to go to hell for other people?
Right. That is a really awesome way of looking at it, and I've never thought about it that way. But I like that as a concept. Obviously, I don't think that I'm going to die now, but the idea that I was willing to, and having that be probably more noble than wanting to worship God so that I can live forever is, I like that. That makes sense.
Now, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they do believe that homosexuality and anything other than just being a straight person is a sin, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses are specifically instructed to be loving and kind, and at the very least respectful to everyone. They stay out of politics entirely, so you're never going to see them campaigning or protesting at abortion clinics. You're never going to see them, marching against, I don't know, like protesting at pride parades or something like that. You're never going to see a Jehovah's Witness at any of those events. But they are definitely not accepting either. I basically was told, when I came out to my family, like, okay, you realize this is something you cannot pursue, though, right? And I was like, yeah, I know that. I'm never going to pursue a relationship with a woman, and I'm totally aware of that. But I thought that you guys needed to know that this is how I feel. And they were like, okay. I always knew, like, I knew when I realized it, and I knew when I became a little bit more accepting of myself. Really, the reason that I left initially was because of that relationship that I was in, because I realized that it was going to go nowhere if I had to keep it a secret, and I couldn't just do it.
Right.
And I have had a friend later come out to me and say, hey, you've been to fellowship for a little while. Well, listen, I'm mentally out now. I have a 1 year long plan for me preparing to move out of my parents' house and, stop going to the meetings and just get out of it. And she listed one of the main reasons that she was leaving was because of a lot of homophobia that she had experienced and seen, which was really surprising to me, because I've heard, kind of vague remarks, but I've never heard anybody say things that were outright really homophobic, because that's very much discouraged. People being, you can say homosexuality is a sin and it's disgusting, and that's totally fine to say. But if you say something like, God hates fags, that would be like, whoa, you're taking that pretty far.
Right.
Like, you can't use slurs. You can't swear. So using a slur is basically along the same lines as swearing. You can't, and you can't go up to two women holding hands and be like, you're disgusting and you're going to burn in hell or anything like that,
Right.
Witnesses don't do stuff like that. They keep it pretty close to their chest, but it's there. They don't, if they have like a gay coworker, they're probably not going to specifically avoid them or anything like that. They probably aren't going to want to hear about their home life at all, but they, aren't going to specifically do or say anything that is outwardly homophobic.
So the reason that I ask is because, you talked a lot about how there are so many things that are not only considered sins but considered apostate. And I don't know if homosexuality or anything relating to that is considered that with Jehovah's Witnesses. But what was interesting was that it sounded like your family is really devout, and yet somehow they were able to balance that devotion to also being willing to at least not shun you for being bisexual.
Well, I hadn't acted on my bisexuality, I guess, is what you could say, which is the reason that they didn't shun me, because there was no sin that had been committed. You know, I had attraction to women, and they understood that, but I had not done anything with women, so it didn't matter. You know, like it was just another temptation that I had to look out for, and I was letting them know that this is an issue that I have, you know, but it wasn't, you know, it was nothing that I could have been shunned for, because I hadn't acted on it.
So if you were in a relationship with a woman, or if you were in that polyamorous relationship, then that would be shun worthy.
Yes. Yes.
Gotcha.
That would be. You know, what's interesting about my parents, my mom a little bit too, but especially my dad is a huge Star Trek nerd. He is a huge Trekkie. I am too, because of him.
Me too.
Nice. And I remember watching this episode of Next Gen with my dad. I think it was Next Gen. Yeah. It was this episode where there was this alien species that was, you know, visiting the Enterprise, and they were like a genderless species, and Riker was in love with one of them, and they were like, oh my God, I think that I'm female. And it was like, what? You have a gender? And then the other aliens found out about it. And then when Riker saw them again, they were like acting like they had seen a ghost or something, like a blank slate. Like, no, I'm fine. You know, don't worry. Everything is good now. I'm not confused anymore. And my dad paused the episode, and he was like, listen, so this is based on a real thing that happens in real life. It's called gay conversion therapy. And he explained this to me, and I'd never heard of it before. And I was like, wow, that's really messed up. And he was like, yeah, it is. And there was the kind of this understanding between us, you know, that, or at least an understanding that was made implicitly clear that my father is aware that homosexuality is not something that someone can change about themselves, and trying to do so would be cruel. My dad also made me and my siblings watch Roots when we were kids. My dad is black. My mom is not, so we're kind of interracial. But my dad wanted us to know, like, listen, this is the story. This is our heritage, and this is important. And he made us sit down and watch Roots. And all of these, and I remember when I was friends with my trans friend, my mom kind of was just like, I don't even know, she remarked to me one time, she was like, it's so weird when you say, oh yeah, he's on his period today, he wasn't feeling very good. Like, do you know how weird that sounds to me? And I'm like, so later I asked my dad, you know, something about like, at a family worship, I was like, listen, I met this was actually before I was friends with my trans friend in high school, actually. I met a trans person in a volunteer job that I had, and their name tag said Miranda, but they said to call them and, you know, to call him and introduce him as Mitchell. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And I did it. And then later that night we had family worship, and I was like, hey, Dad, so if I meet a trans person and they ask me to call them by a different name than their given name, what should I do? Because this is what I did in this situation, but what should I, you know, is that right? Is that what we do? And he basically said, there's nothing wrong with respecting somebody's name or their pronouns, because, you know, I mean, you know, if somebody asks you to call them by a nickname, you're going to do it, and there's no problem with that. So why would there be any problem with calling somebody by the name that they want to be called? Obviously, whether or not that's, you know, what God wants is something entirely different. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with just calling somebody by the name that they want to be called. And you should, because it's respectful. You know, specifically trying not to, you know, specifically calling them by the name that they specifically ask you not to would be rude. And all of these things make me, just really impress upon me the idea that if my parents weren't, well, I mean, my dad more so, I think that my mom would come around, though, because when I did talk about, you know, my trans friends with my mom, even though she was weirded out by it, when they were around, she would use the correct pronouns and the correct name, and she was respectful.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't, like, talk a lot of shit about them when they weren't around or anything, but she would remark that it sounded strange. And I was like, listen, Dad said that we're supposed to use their name and their pronouns, and then it's respectful, and that's what I'm going to do. And I just think that my dad would be so much more progressive. I know that he would be, you know, standing up for people's civil rights. I know that he would be involved in politics if he weren't a Jehovah's Witness. I think that my parents are genuinely good people that are literally just being kept from doing good things by their religion.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's like, so do you know if, like, they converted to Jehovah's Witnesses when they were, like, later on in life, or do you know if they were raised into it as well?
My mom was raised into it. My grandparents on my mom's side, I think, were introduced to the religion in, like, the 60s before they had kids, possibly before they were married. I don't remember the specifics of how they came into the religion, but I know that they came into it, I believe, together. I think. And then my mom and all of her siblings were raised as Jehovah's Witnesses. My dad, he came into the religion when he was about 12. The whole family started, learning to be Jehovah's Witnesses when he was about 12, and he was a really scholarly kid. My dad is one of the smartest people that I know, and I respect his intellect and his logical thinking. And it really saddens me that there's such a huge cognitive dissonance, obviously, between, you know, his beliefs and, you know, every other aspect of his thinking. But yeah, he was raised in it from a pretty young age, but he sought it out, actually. I asked him a long time ago, you know, Dad, why did you become a Jehovah's Witness?
Right.
What about this religion made you, you know, and he said that it had a ring of truth to it. That was the wording that he had used. He said that it had a ring of truth to it. And, you know, when I looked at the time, I was like, yeah, that's because it's the truth. But now looking back, I'm like, is that enough? You know, I mean, you were 12. Something that sounds true to a 12-year-old isn't necessarily true. And that kind of distresses me now, you know, like, my parents met because they were Jehovah's Witnesses, though. They met, I literally would not have been born if my parents weren't witnesses, but I still kind of am like, you know, I don't know. I guess there's a part of me that thinks that I would rather have never been born and my parents never have met than knowing that the two of them, who are good people with good morals, get indoctrinated at such a young age and change the ways they live, that they would have otherwise lived their lives.
Right. Do you said that conversation at the very beginning of our conversation, you said that you only spoke very briefly to your mom recently. Do you still talk to your dad? The last time that I saw my dad was at a convention because they convinced me to go last summer. Or my mom convinced me to go, and I told her that I would. And at that point, I was basically an atheist. So I was kind of curious to see how this stuff would all look through my eyes now. Like, now that I'm not in it mentally at all, like, how would this look to me? And at the same time, I knew that my entire family would be there, and I wanted to see them. So I agreed to go, and my at the time boyfriend, now fiance, went with me. And at the end of the day, as we were leaving, my mom hugged me, and then I tried to hug my dad, and he didn't hug me back. That sucks, Rachel. I'm really sorry. Like, that really sucks. And
sorry, I need this.
It's okay. Do you want to take a minute? I'm really not trying to
no,
bring
I'm
up
okay.
the rough stuff. I mean, that just really that fucking blows.
Yeah, my mom is really the only person who I've had any kind of regular contact with since I got disfellowshipped. I haven't talked to my brother or sister at all since I got disfellowshipped, and I talked to my dad maybe like once. When I initially left the house, because I moved out about a week before I actually got disfellowshipped.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically just did that because I knew that when I got disfellowshipped, they would have to kick me out, and I didn't want that. I didn't want my last, memories with them of being them asking me to leave. So I left because I knew that would be the inevitable result. Like either way, I was going to be out of the house. So I left of my own accord so that they wouldn't feel like they had to kick me out, because I can imagine that must be the hardest thing for a parent to feel like they must do. And obviously I'm of the opinion that they didn't have to do it, but I knew that's how they felt. And I knew that they thought that it was the right thing to do and that it would be the hardest thing ever, but they felt like they had to do it. So I just left so that they wouldn't have to be the ones to kick me out. And I moved in after I moved out. I moved in with one of my old school friends and her uncle. I learned a lot from her uncle. Her uncle was like the gay old man full of wisdom that I strived to be. he had his friend who lived with him, and he had his old bird that he had in the house, and he had a bunch of weird paintings, and they smoked a lot of weed, and I was just like, this is kind of ideal.
Right.
This is like, I don't know what it is about this, but this is just like, it just seemed just quirky little ideal life to me. But he was on assisted living. And at one point, he told me, he was like, hey, I'm going to have an inspection soon. After I'd been living with him for maybe 1 or 2 months, he was like, hey, I'm having an inspection come in soon, so you're going to have to move out by this date. And I had no game plan. I had nowhere to go. This happened to be literally like an hour after I had scheduled my first date with my now fiance. Mm-hmm. And he ended up letting me stay with him. After on our first date, I was like, hey, so I don't want you to think that the reason I started looking around was because I needed a place to stay. But I literally found out about this like an hour after we scheduled our date, but I'm going to be homeless soon.
Right.
And he immediately was just like, you can stay with me. You can stay with me whenever you need to. It's fine.
Right.
We hit it off really well. So it was like, at the time we were having this conversation, we were walking around in a park at night. Mm-hmm. So at this point, we have pretty good trust with each other, because it's like, if either of us was going to murder each other, it would have happened by now. So, So we had established some trust.
Yeah. You both weren't murdered. That's good.
Yeah.
My wife and I got married after we were together for like 9 months, which sounds like it was a shotgun wedding. It wasn't. We just, it felt right. I mean, sometimes it just happens that way, and mm-hmm. It's a good thing that he felt like he wasn't being used for a place to live.
Yeah, and like I said, we honestly knew we were going to get married after like 6 months of dating, but we waited a year to get engaged just for the looks of it, because we didn't want a bunch of annoying questions about like, are you sure, but we were pretty sure. But anyway, but before this, I knew that I couldn't stay with him all the time, because this would be a temporary situation, because he lived in a different city. It was only like 20 minutes away, but it was still a different city from where I had my job.
Right.
So I knew that wasn't going to work out all the time. And I told him, I'm sure that my parents will let me stay at least in my old room just overnight. Like, obviously I'm not going to be living there anymore. They're not going to want me to live there anymore. But I'm sure that facing homelessness, they will let me stay there. And I asked my mom about this, and I was like, hey, can I stay in my old room for right now? This is the situation. And my dad is the one that called me back. And he explained to me very clearly that was not an option. That unless I was changing my mind and I was deciding to come back to the truth and everything, that the house was close to me, even facing homelessness. And that was a really huge shock for me, because even though I knew that they had to kick me out, I thought that, well, they're not going to want me to sleep on the street, so, they'll let me stay with them and for a little bit. And that was a huge shock to me, the fact that they said no. And it wasn't surprising, I guess, that my dad was the one that delivered the news. My mom, in my head, I imagined that my mom got the text message from me, and she went to my dad and said, "What do we do?" And my dad explained to her that they had to stand up for, loyalty to Jehovah, and that he was going to call me and tell me, because my mom was probably in tears. She probably could not have told me that, I don't think that she would have been capable of delivering that news to me. That's how I imagined it in my head. And I'm sure that that's at least close to what actually happened. But, that was really like a turning point in realizing how messed up this situation was, because I had expected to get disfellowshipped. The day after I moved out, I lost my virginity. That was basically my plan. And, but then my aunt and uncle, because I hadn't been disfellowshipped, I hadn't been shunned, I just moved out. So my aunt and uncle had me over the next day to talk to me, and I confessed to my aunt what had happened. And she said, "Okay, well, you need to go to the elders or I will," because, like I said earlier, that's what we're trained to say. That's what we're trained to do, is to tell on each other. So I went to my parents and I told them the situation, and I was again surprised by my dad saying, basically, "I understand that this is something you have to pursue, or that you feel that you have to pursue." And, they never spoke disparagingly about my relationship, even though it was obviously bizarre, at least to a heterosexual monogamous couple. That's pretty much as weird as it gets. My dad said, "I understand that this is something you feel you have to pursue, and I am not going to try to stop you. I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise, but you have to realize the position that puts us in." And I was just like, "Yeah, I understand. You have to disfellowship me. I get that." And I went to the elders, and these are people, I was in a very small congregation because it was a foreign language group. And witnesses will literally learn a whole new language just to target people that are, to target a certain demographic that lives in the area but speaks a different language. And I was in such a group. My whole family had learned a second language so that we could preach to a specific community that lived in our area.
What language?
American Sign Language, actually.
Oh.
So we were seeking out the deaf community. And I still know sign language now, because we were involved in it for maybe 5 or 6 years before I left. So, yeah, I'm still pretty fluent. I've had conversations, when I've worked in stores with deaf customers, trying to help them out and figure out what they need. That's pretty much the extent to which I've used it now. I'm certainly not using it to teach anybody the Bible.
Right. No, it's an awesome thing to learn, but it's the
painful, reasons aren't so great that I learned it.
Right,
to target people who feel alienated from society is the reason that I learned it. But so I've been in this congregation for several years. I know all of the elders in the congregation. They all know me. It's a very small congregation. It's very tight knit. And now I'm sitting down in a room alone with 3 of these men, and I'm confessing to them what I've done. And they asked some questions that made me very uncomfortable, because I had to tell them very specifically what happened. I couldn't just say, "Look, I committed sexual immorality," and they'd be like, "Okay." They asked me exactly what went down, who initiated it. And when I told them, okay, and it stopped here, one of them was basically just said, I don't believe you. I don't believe that a guy would just, stop at that point. And I was just like, "Oh, well, it did." So that's what happened. I mean, why would I lie to you at this point? I've already told you that I've done this and that, and I'm going to get disfellowship for it. Why would I just, what do I have to hide at this point, you know? And, but then I told them, you know, the most heartbreaking part, which I basically just said, listen, I feel kind of ashamed, but I don't feel guilty, and I'm probably going to do it again. And the thing is, with these, you know, like judicial committees, which is basically just 2 or 3 elders sitting down with you and deciding whether or not to disfellowship you, it's based on whether or not you're repentant, you know. And I made it very clear that this was not going to be a one-time thing that I regretted. I didn't regret it. I was going to do it again. And basically, I knew that they were going to disfellowship me because I gave them no choice. I would have been shocked if they hadn't disfellowshipped me, because I worded it very specifically. I knew what the outcome was going to be because I didn't want to live a lie anymore. I was over it. I was like, this is something that I'm going to pursue. This is something I'm going to do. And I made that abundantly clear. And if they hadn't disfellowshipped me, that probably would have disillusioned me that probably would have made me question the faith even more, because then I would have been like, okay, I know and you know that I am a sinner and that I plan to repeat my crime. So why in the world would you keep me in? You know, this isn't, you know, God's justice. You know, that would have probably made me question things even more if they had let me stay in. And for a while when I was out, I still believed. You know, I just believed that I was living in sin, but the more I realized that I was a lot happier with my life and with myself, just being myself, and people were telling me, you know, like, you know, that was really messed up. I'm sorry you went through that. And I'm like, oh, well, you know, I don't hate witnesses or anything. I still kind of am a believer. And people would look at me like I'm crazy. Like, really? They've all shunned you and you're still a believer? Mm-hmm. And I guess that just kind of goes to show just how brainwashed I was, but it took a while for me to mentally get out, even though I physically was out.
And you consider yourself officially an atheist now at this point in your life?
Yeah, I actually becoming an atheist is actually what really made me lose the faith completely. My boyfriend, my now fiance, is an atheist. And he made this pretty clear to me when we first started dating, and I didn't have any problem with it. I've never had problems with knowing or being friends with atheists before. I've always found them to be quite reasonable people. I've always found that I can have frank conversations with them. And for the most part, none of them tried to talk me out of my religion, so it wasn't an issue. I never tried to debate an atheist, and an atheist never tried to debate me. And it was, you know, it just worked out that way. And I've always found that they were always really nice people. I always found out that half of the atheists I knew were gay, so then I was like, hey, me too. So I don't think that's a coincidence, but I didn't have an issue with him, and he was always, you know, a reasonable person. He was open to learning new information. He'd ask me questions about my faith. I never felt like he was trying to specifically get me out, but he asked me questions that, since I hadn't picked up a Bible in 5 or 6 months, I did not have an immediate, you know, like robot answer for. And then I thought about it, and then I would look it up, and then it would be like, yeah, that's not a very good answer. You know, like when I wasn't being constantly inundated with this stuff, being asked those questions actually made me think, as opposed to just immediately giving an answer. Because then I'd have to look up the answer. And then when I saw it, I'd be like, well, this is what they say, but not great, you know?
Yeah.
And he swears it was something else, but I remember, at least the way that I remember it, he was watching, we were in the car driving, and he had on an episode of The Atheist Experience, which is a call-in, you know, atheist talk show. And they were talking with this woman who was a theist, and she had lost her sister, and her sister had committed suicide, I think. Mm-hmm. And one of the atheists was just very sympathetic and very kind and very, I understand that's terrible, I've lost people too. And the other one was like, and do you realize how religion has done people a disservice by not allowing them to properly grieve because they've convinced everyone that they're going to see their family again. Like they're not even really dead. And this is a huge, and for me, as I said before, like that was one of the things that was still mentally keeping me in, was thinking about seeing my grandfather again. And it was really just the last straw for me. Like seeing that and thinking, you know, this is the reason I feel that way. Because religion hasn't prepared me to grieve and to let go. That was kind of like, I started crying, and then he paused the show, and he was like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "I'm an atheist now. And I don't want to be. I don't want to not believe in God, but it's pretty obvious now."
Right.
Like I've had so many, you know, questions about my faith presented to me now that don't make sense anymore, and it does. And I realize now that it never made sense, but since it was what I was told since I was like literally a baby, I had pretty much no choice but to believe it. Mm-hmm. And now that I'm able to exercise my critical thinking skills, it's just very abundantly clear that it doesn't make sense.
This concludes part 2. In the next episode, Rachel and I discuss how her views outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses have changed as her faith has. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. Most importantly, share the show with someone you trust.